Are we ready? Good evening. My name is Thurman Greco, and this is another installment of the show Let's Live. And tonight we're going to talk about hunger. We talk about a lot of different things. I've been writing a book about hunger for a long time, and I'm working on the glossary. And I actually have 3 parts to this glossary. And I'm going to read some things from this glossary. And I think you're going to find them very interesting. But I'm going to begin this session with a prayer about hunger. I stand before you humbly, O Holy One, the one God of Israel. I offer thanksgiving, praises, blessings. I ask for your forgiveness and mercy, O God. All life is in your hands. I come to you asking for protection, not for myself, but for those hungry individuals and families who shop in food pantries everywhere. This hunger weaves the souls of these shoppers together for all time. Grant them hope and strength to travel through their days with a courageous heart. O Holy One, give them grace, mercy, harmony, and peace. Teach those of us working in pantries to have patience as we support the hungry in their struggle to carry on day after day after day. Please let us be continually aware that through the Old Testament, we know you feed all of us, not only physically, but spiritually. Let this awareness give the hungry confidence that their needs are being met. Let this knowledge inspire us to make sure that everyone shopping in pantries everywhere receive the food and support necessary to carry on in the never relenting struggle, and remind us continually that we are doing your work. Help us choose the right words as we communicate with the hungry, so that a chance remark won't make things worse. Make us always aware of the hungry who are homeless and suffering with mental illness. May you grant them complete healing of body, mind, and spirit. O God, to whom we all pray, I offer you my most sincere gratitude for all you have done, are doing, and will do for those of us who suffer with hunger and homelessness. Now I say, Amen. So now I'm going to begin to read some selections from this glossary. And I think it's important to point out that there are different sections of this glossary. One of them deals with hunger in general and food pantries in general, and then another section of the glossary deals with the pantry that I was familiar with. And then another section deals with the people who shopped at the pantry and who volunteered in the pantry. So we have a lot of different listings. But in the generic food pantry glossary, there are a lot of different categories for hunger and a lot of different categories for homeless. And I think it's important for us to all realize that prior to 2005, many of these categories did not exist because we didn't have the need to categorize them in such a way. Since 2005, there have been so many changes in our culture. And for a lot of us, they're not all that aware. We're not all aware of the changes that have taken place in our culture. A lot of us in this country live in our day-to-day lives. We have our jobs, we go to work. The change has been a little bit slow. It's now 2016, almost 2017. The changes haven't been overnight, but you know, we've lost a lot of our middle class in this country since 2005. And so a lot of the affluence that existed in our society in previous years really isn't there anymore. So we do have a need for different listings than we had before. And one of the things that we have is absolute poverty. That's not a term that we heard very often prior to 2005. Absolute poverty, abject poverty, a person who is in absolute poverty, absolutely poor. That is a person who doesn't have enough to eat, who may or may not have a job, or may have 2 or 3 jobs, but whatever these jobs are not bringing in enough money to even begin to cover the expenses. So we have problems with housing, we have problems with food, we have problems with transportation, we have problems with education. We have all kinds of problems when we deal with absolute poverty. And then, of course, we have the relative poor. And that puts us into this sliding scale of poor, just how poor is poor. And when we talk about how poor is poor, one of the things that we're talking about, and one of the ways that we gauge how poor is with the access to food, and the access to transportation, and the access to education. So as we go through this program in the next few minutes, we're going to discuss things like what kind of a scale is a person on the hunger scale? Where are they on this hunger scale? And then we have situational poverty. Situational poverty has to do with being in a situation. And of course, a lot of times people get into a situational poverty category and they get out within 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years. They're able to climb back out. But a lot of them, they can't. If a person becomes situationally poor and cannot develop the skills and does not have the resources to go back to the middle class or to go back where they came from financially and socially, then they are going to remain in a poor situation for the rest of their lives, and it will become a chronic situation. So then we have the chronic poor, and of course the chronic poor they're poor all the time, and this bleeds over into chronically homeless, because some people are homeless for 2 or 3 weeks or 2 or 3 months or 6 months or whatever, and they're managed to get back into some housing. But then sometimes people slip into homelessness and they're never able to get out. And when that happens, then they are chronically homeless. So we have the chronic poor and we have the chronic homeless. And then, of course, we have generational poor. And this is, the grandparents and the parents and the children and the grandchildren. It's all these different generations. And we definitely have a category called generational poor for a person who has been in a situation, in a household situation, for 3 generations. In other words, if your grandmother and your mother and yourself are all poor, or living in poverty, homeless, or whatever, then it's generational because it's gone beyond one generation. And destitute is a whole other word for poor people. Now, destitute is a word that I've heard all of my life, but I have only come recently to realize the true modern description of a destitute person. Most of the people in this country who are destitute are seniors. So they're in my category because I am a senior, and we're destitute. When a person my age becomes poor, you are destitute. You no longer have the finances to take care of your situation. You do not have the strength to get a job, and if you'd had a strength to get a job, nobody's going to hire you. You have outlived possibly your Social Security. You're in a housing situation that is no longer adequate, or maybe you don't live in maybe you don't have housing anymore. So that's where destitution comes in. So the next time you see or hear the word destitute, think of your grandmother. Think of your grandfather. And realize that that's the category that you're in. And you know, a lot of times when people, they kind of slide into destitution. You get on Social Security and you have a job, and then after a while, you can't do the job anymore, so you have no money. And your savings are gone, and Social Security isn't covering the expenses anymore. And you don't have the contacts anymore. If you have not kept yourself connected on a community level, it's really, really hard to get yourself out of this hole that you find yourself sliding into. I know very few people who are able, once you're 75 or 80 or even 70, who are able to pull themselves out of that hole once they get there. And of course, you know, the time comes when you can't drive anymore. The time comes when you have no money anymore. The time comes when your housing is inadequate. The bank account is gone. The Social Security check is what it is. I am reminded of a woman, and I know that after a while, when the takeouts were reduced, there was one woman who was in the category. She was quite elderly, and she needed caregivers. She was way at the end of a road. She had no car. She had only a small wood stove. I mean, it was just, there was no way to get food. It was just destitution is what it is. We also think of, when we think of destitution, we think of the disabled. Disabled people, once you reach a point where you're disabled and you cannot get around on your own, you're definitely in the destitute category. Because if you can no longer afford caregivers, if you can no longer get yourself around, if you can't get to DSS, if you can't get to different places that you need to get to keep the caregivers coming, to keep the food coming, to keep, different things happening, to get health care. There are a lot of old people and disabled people in this country who have no more health care. And the reason they don't have health care is A, they've run out of money, and Medicare and Medicaid don't cover everything. So, they've reached pretty much the end of their line. And because they don't have the resources to get to health care. If you can't get to the doctor, if you can't get to the hospital, if you can't get to the clinic, you're not going to get any health care. It's as simple as that. And, a lot of times older people, I have really observed this. A lot of older people will manage to get to a doctor, and they're old, and the medical staff will assess. You can see it happening. The receptionist, for example, will be talking to the person, and you can see it in their faces. If the person is deaf, they don't always hear what they're supposed to hear, so they don't answer properly. So it's like the staff at the clinic, wherever, or at the hospital or the emergency room or wherever they happen to be, is trying to figure out, how together are you? And, are you beyond help mentally? Are you beyond help emotionally? So there's a lot there which goes to destitution with the elderly and with the disabled. And then we have what we call the economic poor. The economic poor are working age people. So now we've been talking about disabled, and we've been talking about elderly, seniors. 50 plus seniors. Now we're going to talk about the economically poor. And the economically poor are people who are working age, who may often be working, who live in large households, and who live in rural areas. So they are poverty stricken, and they can't get, if they live in a grocery desert, if they live in a food desert, they don't have the wherewithal to get to the grocery store. They're living out of the gas stations. They're living out of the food shelves in the pharmacy. If that, they're, scrounging in dumpsters. It's a really difficult situation because they're transportation limited. They don't have the transportation to get themselves out of the rural area, to get the food they need, to get the clothing they need, to get the health care they need. So, even though I've only gone down 4 or 5 listings, we realize right away that when a person is poor, health care is next to non-existent. That's a given right there. It doesn't make any difference whether you're absolutely poor or situationally poor or chronically poor or generationally poor or destitute or you're a 50 plus senior, whatever. Health care is marginal. It could be better in a lot of cases if the person could get to it. But if they can't get to it, then it might as well, it's not there. It might as well be on the moon. So that's a couple of things that we've talked about. We've talked about relative poverty. We just talked about rural poverty. And, in a rural situation, and in our, you can be 25 or 30 or 50 miles from a hospital, 25, 30, 50 miles from a grocery store, 25 or 30 miles from a school. You're a long way. But you can also be urban poverty stricken. You can be poor in an urban setting. You can be in a city. You can be in a town that's, 50, 100,000 people. And the problems that you have in the urban poor are still the same. You still have problems getting health care. You still have problems getting food. You still have problems getting housing. You have all these problems. But you also have problems with crowding, because in cities, you have like a whole bunch of people living together. And in cities, you'll have housing for the homeless, for example. And a whole family will be in one motel room with a single bed, a small refrigerator, a microwave. We'll have a bathroom, but a number of people are crowded in a very small space. And of course, when you have this crowding and you have all the noise that goes with the city, you're going to have violence. So the issues are very different, but the causes are the same. And a lot of times the result is the same. The person doesn't have enough to eat. The person doesn't have health care. The person doesn't have a place to live. The person can't get school. And I'm showing my age here, but a very few short years ago, people could manage to get the funds together to go to a technical school, to finish high school, to go to college, to go to a university. A lot of people don't have that money anymore. And we've had people going to college and getting loans. And they're learning that they graduate from college, and then they've got to pay this loan back, and they're working minimum wage jobs. So that's kind of discouraging to other people down the line who may try or may want to go to college or think they'd like to go to college. they really get very discouraged. The other kind of poverty that we have is we have suburban poverty. You have poverty of people living not in a rural area and not in an urban area, but in a suburban area. You have a lot of poverty. You have households crowded in houses. You have housing shortages. You have transportation issues. A lot of times in suburban poverty, you have food deserts, and that's a whole other thing. That is a whole other thing. When you have grocery stores, this sounds terrible, but it's really true. When you have grocery stores, there's always dumpsters, and you can dive in the dumpsters. But out in when there's a food desert, you don't really have those dumpsters anymore. So it's more difficult to get food. It's more difficult to get fruits and vegetables. It's easier to get guns than it is to get food, is what that comes down to. Whether you're in an urban, a suburban, or a rural area, it truly is easier to get a gun. It's easier to get a gun than it is to hike 5 miles to the gas station where you manage to get potato chips and a Coke. Where is the food there? And you go into the gas station, you go into the food mart, and maybe there will be some bananas for sale. You can get a banana, maybe an apple. And of course, if you're in a rural area that has farming, then you can crawl over the fence, and when the produce is ripe, you can get fresh produce. And there are a lot of people out there now who are stealing, and they're stealing for food. They're not stealing for money. They're stealing for food. They don't want money. Then we go to abundance. Abundance is what people have when they get what they need, but they don't really have the money for it. A food pantry is an example of abundance, because when you have a food pantry or a soup kitchen, you have food for people who can get there. And of course, we need to know this. When people complain that this food pantry is feeding too many people, or this food pantry is serving people that for whatever reason shouldn't be there, remember that there's a whole other strata of poor people who are going hungry because they can't get to the food pantry. They are transportation challenged. And pantries don't have money. When I first started working in the food pantry in 2005, I was a volunteer. There was no money. There was no money there. It was about 2007 or 2008 before the food banks actually gave classes and told us you need to start raising money. Because in 2005 and 2006, and even a little bit in 2007, the food banks were not really prepared for the number of people that were showing up. Maybe they were, but it was a lot of people mentally were not ready for the numbers of people that were coming. They were not ready to see those kinds of lines. And not only were they not ready, they didn't want to. So the food that mostly comes to food banks, it comes to food banks and subsequently comes to food pantries, is food that has been diverted from a landfill. And there's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of resentment still about people who appear to be looking nice, showing up at a food pantry and hauling off food. And there's still this feeling that, well, if they manage their lives better, if they, whatever, they wouldn't have to be here, we wouldn't have to serve them. That may be true, but it also may be that they are managing their lives as well as they can. If you don't have a car, if you have 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, whatever it is. People, a lot of people are going to food pantries who are doing the very best they can. And food pantries are raising money, but they are working mostly off of abundance. They are working mostly off of food that they are getting that was donated to the food bank or donated to them by individuals, by farmers, by grocery stores, by restaurants, by hotels. Different people and different organizations donate this food. This is food that even 3 years ago was going in the dumpster. So we're learning, food banks and food pantries are learning how to divert the food from the landfill and doing quite well at it. We are doing quite well at it. So I think from an ecological point of view, food pantries are doing really well. And we are raising money. But most of the money goes to buy gas and repairs for the automobile to go and get the food as opposed to buying the food, because food banks have the food. And it's becoming less so now, but used to, there was a big effort to go around to the grocery stores and get all the food and go get it and bring it in and go through it and throw out what was not good and make sure that what you had was clean and looked good and didn't belong in the dumpster, because everything that you get is really marginal. It's really kind of right on the edge, and it's worth fighting for. It's worth fighting for because it's very important. Fresh fruits and vegetables are extremely important to the health of a person. We have a lot of people in this country who are living with what health care they can get. It's coming through Medicaid. It's coming through Medicare. They are not necessarily paying for their medical expenses. Often the medical expenses are pushed off to the side until the person is really, really sick, and it's a terrible situation, and it is beyond taken care of economically. If people were properly fed in the beginning, a lot of diseases that people are treated for now would not even happen. Heart disease is very expensive. Diabetes is very expensive. Cancer is very expensive. If everybody was able to eat clean and eat properly without eating junk food and eating too much fat and eating too much artificial color and too much artificial flavor, if we could eat real food, we would be much healthier as a country, and it would cost the government less. So when you see a food pantry, don't say to yourself, oh, that's a bunch of freeloaders over there. Say to yourself, this is a group of struggling people, and by going to the pantry, they are able to get some nutritious food for themselves and for their children, and that is extremely important. So getting those things is a function of abundance, and we are working off of abundance in this country, and it's a beautiful, beautiful experience. So don't think of the money that your government is spending to feed these people. Think of the money that's being saved. Another entry that I have in one of the glossaries is appearance. Not all hungry people look needy. Not all hungry people are down and out and don't have clean hair. A lot of people manage to take care of themselves quite well. They are shopping at thrift stores. They are shopping at bazaars. They are getting clothes from each other. They are living in towns where there are free stores. There is a culture of people in this country who do not have any money, and they manage somehow to do the best they can with the very little they have. And when I see a person that I know is struggling and I see them look good, I am so grateful. I am so grateful for that. So another listing in the glossary is cardboard. Cardboard is huge. It comes into pantries by the mountain. We took cardboard every day. Pantries take cardboard, empty cardboard, broken down boxes, every day to the dump. If you are getting ready to move and you need some boxes, a good idea is to call a pantry up and say, I'm getting ready to move and I need some boxes. Do you have some? Boxes at pantries are clean. There are very few insects. There's very little vermin. I know that this is hard for people to believe, but there is. Pantries are clean. Food banks are extremely clean. The reason why these places are clean is because the boxes are moved so many times and the food is moved so many times before it finally gets to the food pantry. And an insect or a mouse or whatever will not stay in a box that is being moved. So it's the cardboard boxes are clean. And for the most part, the food that has that comes in these boxes is clean. It's being very well taken care of. Another thing that I'm talking about in my glossary is automobiles. There is a category now called SUV poor, and that's a person who has lost everything but the car. When you see somebody at a food pantry and they're in a fancy car, remember, the car is the past. The car is not the present. It is a remnant. It's a relic of the past. Because the last thing to go is the car. And of course, when you finally have reached the bottom, the car does go because you don't have the money to repair it anymore. Or you're in a wreck and you don't have the money to replace it anymore. But for a long time or a short time, for a time, a person who is in a poverty-stricken situation will have a nice car. If they had a nice car before. If they didn't have a nice car before, they won't. But it's just, that just tells you how far they fell. So don't begrudge a pantry shopper an automobile. Also, another thing that's very important is the realization that in a pantry, there's really not that much choice. You go over to a grocery store or a supermarket anywhere in this country, and you're going to see at least 10,000 items in that store. You are going to see fresh, frozen, canned, boxed. You're going to see all kinds of things. In a food pantry, you're going to see maybe 30. 50 if the food pantry is fantastic. So there's a real difference. And learning to cook with these 30 items is extremely important because people who shop in pantries cook, they eat, it's a completely different world. There's so few things, and a lot of it is new. Every time you go to a food pantry, if the person who is managing the pantry has got a lot of fresh produce, invariably you're going to see things you've never seen before. You're going to see food you've never seen before. You don't even know what the stuff is called. Take your share, go home, look it up, go to the library if you have time. If you don't have time, ask somebody. If you have an iPhone, Google it. If you have a computer, Google it. Find out how it's cooked, cook it, and eat it. If you are in a really top-notch pantry, you're going to have access to new foods every week. And if you do this every week, by the end of a year, you are going to have such a totally different knowledge of food than you had at the beginning of the year. It will be an education. And take this training. It's being offered to you. Take the food, eat it, cook it, serve it, enjoy it or not enjoy it, but learn about it and definitely prosper through it. This is part of the abundance of a food pantry. This is one of the plus sides, really. The minus side, there are a lot of minus sides to go into pantries, but there are a lot of plus sides too. And getting to be around a lot of new and different foods is a really good thing. Another thing that we have not discussed that's in the glossary is dental health. There is no dental health in a food pantry. People who come to a pantry do not have any dental health. They haven't been to a dentist. They don't go to a dentist. And when they do go to a dentist, it's because they are in so much pain. And as they go, eventually they lose many of their teeth, if not all of them. And when you have a person who has no teeth, you have a person who has a lot of foods they cannot eat because they don't have any teeth, they can't chew them. And that directly affects a person's health. When you have no teeth, you've got a problem. You've got a health problem. And it's a shame in this country that we do not have more dentists, that people who are in a poverty situation do not have access to a dentist. And I'm going to talk about diabetes now because diabetes is so prevalent in this country. It is a very popular disease and it's a very expensive disease. It's a disease for the most part that could be dealt with lifestyle, with eating, being able to eat clean foods, being able to get the proper exercise, being able to stay healthy physically, mentally, and emotionally helps with preventing diabetes. I don't know how many people who go to pantries have diabetes, but I'm going to hazard a guess. I'm going to say 30%. I don't know. I just know from talking to people and over time listening to them and finding out what their needs are as far as diabetes is concerned. And many people who have diabetes are not really getting the kind of treatment that they need. They're doing the best they can. They are, eating as properly as they can, but when you have no money, it's really difficult to eat all the right things. So diabetes is a huge factor in poverty. And it's something that if we could deal with it, the expenses of our government would be down. If people could eat proper foods, if they could stay away from fried grease, as I call it, if they could stay away from, sugar on sugar, if they could get exercise. These things are impossible for many, many people. So diabetes is sort of a fact of life. And then going along with our diabetes, we have dietary restrictions. We have, for example, kosher food, which as far as I can tell is non-existent in pantries. I know that in the pantries that I managed, it was not available. It was not available through the food bank. And I couldn't find any way to get anybody to donate it to me. I just did not have the skills for that. And it's a real shame, because if a person cannot eat the food that they have grown up with, they cannot eat the food that offers them not only physical sustenance but spiritual sustenance. It's very difficult. And of course, we think about kosher food, but you need to go beyond that. We live in a culture now where, in the cities especially, but throughout our nation, we are not just one type of person. We are not just one type of food. We have Oriental food. We have European food. We have religious food. We have kosher food. We have halal. We have all kinds of different societal hooks to the food that we eat. And when I run across people who are first-generation immigrants to this country, I realize that people who come to this country are pioneers. I know that there's a movement to throw everybody out, but people who come to this country are working very, very hard, as are all kinds of poverty-stricken people in this country. But when a person comes to this country, whether they come from China or Russia or Korea or El Salvador or Guatemala or whatever, they leave behind so much. They leave behind all the food that they're used to. They leave behind the costumery that they're used to. They no longer dress like they did in the village or town or country where they lived. They leave behind their language because they're learning a new language. They leave behind their family because once you get here, it's very, very hard to leave and come back. Legal or not, it's very, very difficult. And there is this fear, especially among the ones that are even legal, that they'll go home and they'll get the airplane ticket back here, but for some reason they'll be detained and sent back. So there is this, you know, you've left your country behind, you've left your family, you've left your clothing, you've left your religion, you've left your food, you've left everything. And food is so important. Food is one of the core physical, spiritual, emotional aspects of our lives. And so they come to this country, especially if you come from Africa or you come from Asia. You know, people in Korea, people in China, people in Vietnam, they're not going to go back and eat the food that they ate there. And, you know, we do have things like sushi, we do have things like Korean food and Vietnamese food, but it is not the same. So there's this kind of poverty that goes with coming to this country. And we have no idea how many people come into this country. Everybody seems to think that the people who come to the pantry who are from other countries have come from Latin America. But I was reading some statistics recently, and we're believing that more people are coming from the Orient than are coming from Latin America. So that's an interesting thing to know. Donations. Donations are very, very important. Your pantry, the pantry near you, may not be asking for donations, but you know, donations are necessary. Peanut butter is not readily available in food pantries. It's there sometimes, it's never there enough for everybody to have some. So if you can't do anything more than take a couple of jars of peanut butter to a food pantry, you have done something. If you have a garden and you have a few extra tomatoes and you have a few extra cucumbers or whatever, if you take it to the food pantry, you will be greatly appreciated. There's nothing wrong with sharing what you have. And a lot of food pantries have thrift shops. They have free stores. You can take your clothes there. You can take books there. There are a lot of things that you can do that will enhance the abundance of the food pantry. Eggs are extremely important. Eggs offer a lot of nutrition in a little package. And not every food pantry has eggs, but they're not expensive. They're easy to store. They're easy to cook. You don't have to have a complicated kitchen to cook an egg. They are very nutritious. They are a clean food in that there's not a lot of junk that comes there with them. So it's an egg is a pure food, and it's a wonderful thing to have. So if you have a chance to donate some eggs to a pantry, that would be wonderful. One of the things that you can remember when you shop at a food pantry, when you donate to a food pantry, when you volunteer at a food pantry, one of the things that you can keep in mind, and this won't resonate with everybody, but it will resonate with some of us, is you are minimizing your footprint. When you give something to a food pantry or when you shop at a food pantry, you are minimizing your footprint. So this is good for the environment. When you eat food that was destined to the landfill, you are doing something wonderful for your planet. And when you take food to the food pantry, you're doing something wonderful for the planet. And when you take clothes that you're no longer going to use, or you take furniture, or you take whatever it is that you can take to the thrift shop, you are doing something positive for our planet at a time when we really need it. So that's a really nice thing to keep in mind. Food pantries are all about feeding. And of course, the three most hot button words in the American English language, are food, sex, and money. And food really goes right to the core because it raises so many questions and it brings to mind so many core beliefs. You know, when we start talking food and feeding, all of a sudden, the discussions come out. Who is it okay to feed? You know, who can you feed anyway? And how much is it okay to feed? There's a whole bunch of people out there that feel like, well, you don't want to give them that much food. You don't want to give them that kind of food. Come on, it came from the landfill. Give me a break. Let's get rid of it before it has to go back to the landfill. And when is it okay to feed? How can you feed somebody every week? How can you feed somebody every month? And what are you doing feeding somebody on a holiday? And, well, you know, people are, you know, we need food to live. And then, of course, how dare you serve this kind of food to this kind of people? There is a real problem with a lot of people in our country about how dare you serve this kind of food to somebody at a food pantry. What are you doing? You're serving cakes. You're serving meat. You're doing milk. What are you doing? Well, we're feeding people, and it's food that was otherwise going to the landfill. So what's wrong with it? It's donated food. But these are. I can say this until I drop dead here at this table, or until the cows come home. And there's a lot of people I'm never going to convince of this, because everybody has their own ideas about who it's okay to feed, how much it's okay to feed, and when it's okay to feed, and what it's okay to feed, and why. How dare you serve food to somebody with a car? If they have a car, they don't need to be coming to a pantry. These are the core beliefs that we carry with us. And, most of us don't even stop to think about, where did we get this core belief? Where did it come from? Is this something that we saw as a child? Is this something that we read about in the newspaper? Is it something that we heard? What is this, a belief that just came in their mind? My belief is that you feed anybody that shows up. But that's my belief, and I certainly didn't get it from my mother, and I certainly didn't get it in school. I don't know where I got that belief, but that's my belief. So, we have different attitudes about feeding. We also have different attitudes about sex. We have different attitudes about money. So if you can just realize it's in a category, and hey, this is food that we're going to otherwise clutter up the landfill with, then you may have a different attitude. And there is this attitude about feeding the unworthy, hungry. And where do all these people come from? Well, when people are hungry, if they know there's food, they're going to go to it. And you also have to realize, a person may live in a town 25 miles away, or even 50 miles away, or 10 miles away. But they're working, and they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or they bummed a ride from a neighbor or whatever, and they managed to get to this pantry when it was open. Has nothing to do with where they live. It has to do with getting there. Because many people, I'm going to go out on a limb, I'm going to say most people that go to food pantries are transportation challenged. And so if you can get here on a Tuesday when this place is open, that's where you go. And, you know, if the pantry in your neighborhood is open on Thursday and you're working 10 miles away on Thursday and can't get to that pantry's not going to do you any good. You have to go to the pantry that you can get to when it's open. So that's the answer to that one. But in any event, the word food touches our core beliefs, and it goes straight to the heart and soul. And so you may have totally different opinions. Your blood pressure may be going up. I don't know. And truly, I hold no anger for you. It's just that this is the way it is. These are the hot button issues. The next thing that we have, the next word in this glossary is a political word. It's a freegan. And I don't know how many of you have ever heard of the word freegan. But a freegan is a person who goes after things are free politically. And to some people, being a freegan is not a positive term. Hey, if you're willing to stop food from going to the landfill, you're fine with me. I don't have any problem with that. But there are a lot of people out there who do call themselves freegans, and that's very different from a dumpster diver. A dumpster diver, for the most part, is a person who really would like to have some fresh produce and doesn't have any other way to get it. But a freegan is looking for stuff that's free. It's completely different. And I'm going to talk now about giving up the past, because this is a very important transition that people make when they go into a food pantry. We go down the path to a food pantry, and certain things have to happen to a person in order to get to a food pantry. And one of the things that happens to people on the way to the food pantry is that they give up the past. It's very, very interesting. I have worked in 2 food pantries for a very long time, and if you listen to the conversations in the hallway, nothing ever goes past 3 weeks behind. By the time you get to a pantry, you are into the now. I want to take this moment to thank everyone who watched this program. I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for approving or not approving. This is my upcoming book, which is going to be months, but anyway, I am working on it. And if you heard the prayer at the very beginning, if you have some opinions, good, bad, or indifferent, I would really like to know that too. And again, thank you very much for watching and listening to this program. Good evening.